This conviction, we expect, will bring a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. It is a sentence from which there is no escape and no return. This conviction is a victory for the American people who has suffered so long and so much while Guzman made billions pouring poison over our southern border.
You're listening to Narcotica, a podcast giving you the straight dope about drugs and the people who use them.
That was U.S. Attorney Richard Donahue selling the masses his justice served narrative after the conviction this week of Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán. Better known by his nickname, Spanish for Shorty, Guzman rose to prominence in the Sinaloa Federation drug trafficking organization, where he allegedly became the most prolific and successful drug profiteer in history. Ironic, then, that a nation where capitalism is the only common religion wouldn't find something to admire in a man who came from a humble background, worked his way up the ranks of a powerful organization, neutralized his rivals along the way, and took over its leadership. From 2008 until his second capture in 2014, Guzman's pharmaceutical manufacturing giant, if you will, was the primary supplier of illicit marijuana, heroin, cocaine, and methamphetamine to the United States. Today, it is said the Sinaloa drug cartel's reach extends to the Far East. During Guzman's reign, Mexico's drug trafficking gangs experienced a tenuous but measurable peace known among academics as Pax Sinaloa. But now that a head of the hydra has been severed, who knows what will emerge? I'm Troy Farah, and you're listening to Narcotica. On this episode, my co-host Christopher Moraff traveled to the Vice News office in Brooklyn to speak with editor Keegan Hamilton, who has been closely tracking Guzman's trial since it began. Before we get to that, this is just a quick note to say that Narcotica is an independent, ad-free production, and we want to keep it that way. If you like the show, learn how to support us at patreon.com/narcotica. And now on to the program.
I'm Keegan Hamilton. I'm the U.S. editor at Vice News and the host of the podcast Chapo Kingpin on Trial.
And Keegan's been following the trial and covering the trial. And prior to that, you've spent some time in Mexico digging deeper into the legacy of El Chapo. Why don't you talk a little bit about how that sort of facilitated itself and what the process was like getting that kind of access?
So we started working on this podcast about a year ago in January 2018, and I'd been following, Chapo as a figure for, years now, especially since he was extradited to the U.S. to stand trial. Once we knew that this trial was going to happen, that it was actually going to go to trial and he wasn't going to plead guilty, we really wanted to tell the story in a different way that it had been told, go deeper, and really give people a more nuanced understanding than just Chapo is the kingpin who's responsible for all of these drugs coming into the U.S. and the one guy who's running the Sinaloa cartel. It's more complicated than that, and we wanted to do that story justice. And in order to do that, we knew we had to go to Sinaloa and talk to people on the ground there.
And how did you manage to do that? What was it?
Like a lot of foreign reporting, we really relied heavily on a fixer. If you listen to our podcast, we tried to be as transparent as possible about that. The first episode of the show is called The Fixer, and we introduce our listeners to the guy we work with, Miguel Angel Vega, who is a reporter for the local newspaper Rio Doce, which sort of specializes in covering organized crime and the drug trade in Sinaloa. He has some amazing connections in Culiacan and the state of Sinaloa to people in basically every facet of the drug trafficking trade.
Journalists have been targeted a lot in Mexico. How has he managed to sort of navigate both sides of the trade without making enemies? And did you ever feel like your life was in danger while you were there?
The threat to journalists is very real in Mexico. Unfortunately, it's the Mexican reporters who are in the line of fire much more so than foreign reporters. I think, as it was explained to us and as I think is accurate, the cartels know that if they target a foreign reporter, it's going to cause problems. The last thing they want is to have something impact their business, and killing an American who's coming to the country to report is certainly going to have blowback. On the other hand, we've seen over and over that cartels can kill Mexican reporters with impunity, and that's something that is covered as well in the podcast. Is Miguel Angel was personally affected by that. The co-founder of his newspaper, Javier Valdez, was murdered in 2017, pretty much in the aftermath of El Chapo's capture and extradition. So we talk about that in the show and how it affected him. He basically had to leave his hometown of Culiacan and now lives in Mexico City and goes back to report.
So let's talk a little bit about the legacy of El Chapo, the mythology of Shorty versus the man. What did you learn that may be, different or the same about the two? I mean, he is one man that has, a legacy that sort of outreaches certainly his status, I would think, and as is common with kingpins and people in the trade and even journalists at times. So, what did you learn about Chapo the man that you found maybe conflicted or sort of supported the way he's viewed in the media?
Certainly there is a lot of myth to the El Chapo story, and one of the things that we set out to do was cut through that myth and tell people who El Chapo really is. And like any myth, or like most myths, there is some sort of granule of truth at the heart of it. We wanted to go to his hometown in Sinaloa, in the mountains of the Golden Triangle. It's a very remote area. It takes about 5 hours to drive there from the nearest major city, Culiacan. And we wanted to speak with his family and hear about, who this guy was when he was growing up, before he was famous. The story that everyone always tells about El Chapo was that he was so poor that his family needed him to go sell oranges by the side of the road as a way to make some money. We met with his mom and sister and asked, is that true? They said, yeah, he really did sell items by the side of the road, oranges, bread that his mom would make. He would go to the sort of like the only store in this town and buy snacks, and then go down the road to try to sell goods by the highway. Eventually, he starts growing marijuana and poppy to be refined into heroin, and gets involved in the drug trade in Mexico starting in the late 70s, much more so in the 80s, and then in the early 90s is when he sort of catapults into fame. He was at one point sort of an anonymous mid-level drug trafficker. But then in 1993, there's this incident at the airport in Guadalajara, Mexico, where a cardinal from the Catholic Church is murdered. The cardinal's murdered in what is described most often as a sort of a case of mistaken identity, where somebody was trying to kill Chapo, and they thought that the cardinal was him because he was driving in a similar car. Chapo is ultimately sort of blamed for this killing, and that is the moment when he becomes, El Chapo, a name that everyone knows. He spends the next 8 or 9 years in prison, and then, of course, his 2001 escape, purportedly in a laundry cart from a maximum security prison, is what then takes him to the next level. And it grows and grows and grows. He escapes again through a tunnel. He meets Sean Penn. All of these, events over the years build and build and build on each other until El Chapo, the humble boy from the mountains of Sinaloa, becomes El Chapo, the all-powerful kingpin, the Pablo Escobar of our time.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like much like, maybe John Gotti, the Teflon Don, much of Chapo's fame was sort of this untouchable quality that he had. So what kind of network did he establish that he became the most prolific drug trafficker of our time? At its peak, what did the Sinaloa cartel encompass?
So, of course, El Chapo did not do it alone. He really relied on key partners in the Sinaloa cartel. When you hear a lot of news coverage about El Chapo, and I think the average person assumes that he is the leader of the Sinaloa cartel. There's just one guy. In reality, the Sinaloa cartel is a federation. That's another name for it, where it's a partnership of high-level drug traffickers. So El Chapo was really relying heavily on his cousins, the Beltran Leyvas, who later had their own cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization. Of course, El Mayo Zambata, who has never been arrested and is Chapo's partner atop the Sinaloa cartel, and a handful of other key figures in the Mexican drug trade, all really helped El Chapo. For the most part, when he was in prison from 1993 to 2001, he was still able to run his business because he had bribery in the prison to be able to communicate with the outside world. And also he had the Beltran Leyvas, he had El Mayo, he had members of his family who were helping him in running that business on the outside. And even when he's arrested later on, the way he's able to tunnel out of prison is through his network of corruption.
And corruption is endemic in local police forces in Mexico, which is part of why the drug war down there began relying on federales. Would you say that local police, in your experience down there and what you learned from your fixer, are still closely involved in the trafficking organizations?
Undoubtedly. I mean, I've also been covering El Chapo's trial in the courtroom pretty much every day for over 2 months now. And the testimony that we've heard, it's clear that virtually every level of the Mexican government and police forces are corrupt. That's not saying every police officer in Mexico or every member of the military is corrupt, but we've heard everything from the local beat cops up to the state police, up to the federal police, up to military generals, up to the attorney general's office, and just recently the accusation that even the president of Mexico accepted a $100 million bribe from El Chapo.
So obviously on my beat, I cover the fentanyl crisis and the influx of fentanyl, which began really in 2006 with El Cerebro and the lab that was broken down there that caused close to 2,000 deaths in America. And then there was sort of a quiet period. Did you find any evidence during your time down there that Sinaloa is involved in the production or trafficking of fentanyl, or do they rely primarily on their poppy growing?
Absolutely. One of the episodes of our show, we go into the Golden Triangle, and we wanted to meet the farmers who were sort of at the bottom of the supply chain growing poppy for the cartel. And the folks that we spoke to were complaining that the value of opium gum had plummeted in the last year and a half, 2 years or so, because there was less of a demand for classic heroin, because the cartel had figured out how to synthesize fentanyl and was making it in large quantities. So what was once the only way for them to make opioids for export to the United States, suddenly there's a new way that cuts out farmers, that reduces costs, and doesn't rely on seasonal poppy harvests anymore. You can have basically one guy in a lab cranking out kilos of fentanyl, 365 days a year.
Right. And so I'm always fascinated with the way certain policy decisions create, the environment for unintended consequences to occur. And so, the crackdown on domestic meth pushed a lot of the precursor trade into Mexico, and there's been a strong line of, supply lines from China to Mexico for the meth trade primarily. Is Chapo and was the Sinaloa cartel involved heavily in meth production as well?
We've heard a lot of testimony about that in the trial, and sort of interestingly, some of the witnesses have made it seem as though one of the cartel's biggest business challenges was acquiring ephedrine to synthesize methamphetamine. However, clearly there's been no problem getting methamphetamine. Some of my colleagues on our show, Vice News Tonight on HBO, just recently went to a meth lab in Sinaloa where they talked about how just the massive amounts of drugs that they can manufacture, and how demand for meth in the United States is just growing and growing and growing. So certainly meth is one of the more lucrative exports for the Sinaloa cartel. And just like fentanyl, they're not relying on plants in order to make this drug. It's more lucrative because all you need to do is buy the chemicals and have one trained cook who can make the product for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we're seeing now in Philadelphia for the first time, like high quality pure glass crystal, which was largely non-existent from the streets of Kensington. And I've seen it sold on the streets now. It's sort of an ad hoc process at this point. It hasn't kind of adapted into the established heroin sets. But and I've heard various reasons for that. One of which is that the cartels are sort of mandating that along the distribution chain that methamphetamine be taken along with fentanyl, if you want that. And I think part of that has to do with the different corridors. And one of my big criticisms about the way the media covers the fentanyl issue is that it's just one monolithic sort of fentanyl market, where it's hyperlocal, geographically, the types of analogs, the types of, and the supply chains are vastly different. So Atlanta seems to be a strong hub for the transportation of methamphetamine and fentanyl, and that runs up to Philly and New York. What did you learn about the corridors that Sinaloa runs?
The testimony in the trial that we've heard so far, it's clear that the big hubs for the cartel are Phoenix, L.A., Chicago. Most of the drugs that the Sinaloa cartel crosses are going across the western edge of the United States borders. So that's Nogales, that's Mexicali, Calexico, and San Diego, Tijuana are the primary crossing points. And then those drugs get to Phoenix, those drugs get to L.A., where they're broken down again and shipped primarily, in vehicles, semi-trucks, or even smaller vehicles with hidden compartments across the country.
Another fascination of mine in covering drugs and drug markets is this idea of the what I call the freelancer effect, that when you break down structure, you create balkanization, which is happening among the Mexican cartels now. What do you make of the so-called Pax Sinaloa, where, at least for a time, there was a brief lull in some of the violence as Chapos solidified his hold? What are your thoughts on what's going on now, where there's balkanization among many of the cartels, and how much has that been a challenge in the absence of El Chapo to Sinaloa maintaining its dominance?
Certainly, some of the worst periods of violence in Mexico occurred when the cartel fractured. There was the break between Chapo and the Beltran-Legava organization, which caused some horrific violence in Mexico in the late 2007, 2008, 2009. And then the feud between the Sinaloa cartel, specifically El Chapo, and the Juarez cartel turned Juarez into the murder capital of the Western Hemisphere for a good 3 to 4 years. There's a lot of dispute about what led to the violence declining. If you ask the government of Mexico, they'll say it was their security forces coming in and restoring order. If you ask people who are familiar with the drug trade and people who are involved in it, they will say that there was a peace agreement that, everybody said, let's stop the blood. It's bad for business. Let's just get back to doing what we do, and that's shipping drugs across the border. Now we're seeing in Mexico, the places with the worst violence are where there is no controlling cartel force. The state of Guerrero was once under control by the Beltran-Leyva organization. Now that has crumbled, there are just smaller criminal groups who are fighting amongst each other, and that's really fueling the violence.
Mm-hmm. We have a case against Los Ardillos, a Los Ardillos operative as far up as Montgomery County. So, yeah, it seems that there is who controls the borders, the corridor crossings, and then who is on the ground in the regions where poppy is being grown or the synthetics are being made. and then who controls the ports, which are, of course, important for precursors. What do you make of the New Halisco, the CGNJ? Have they been a strong rival of Sinaloa as it's made out to be in the media, or are they still a weaker player in this?
Everything I've heard about the Halisco New Generation Cartel is that they are a force to be reckoned with. They do control the state of Halisco, which is south of Sinaloa, and some of the key ports in that state. I haven't heard as much about conflict between those two cartels. It seems that there is some violence, as there will inevitably be, as they sort of one encroaches on another's territory. But that doesn't seem to me to be what's fueling the worst violence in Mexico right now. As we were just talking about, it's those areas where there isn't one controlling cartel force. Areas like the city of Acapulco, which for a long time was a key corridor for the Sinaloa cartel to bring cocaine from South America and ship it north. Now that the group that once controlled Acapulco, specifically the cartel figure La Barbie, is out of the picture, that's no longer has the ties to the United States, and the drug market is in chaos, with groups fighting each other for control without having the source of money and stabilization that they once had. And we get into this situation where it almost sounds like you want the cartel to exist because it maybe makes it more peaceful somehow. And I'm not sure that that's the argument I want to be making, that it's somehow better to have a cartel controlling everything, because there's something perverse about that. But I don't think there's any denying that, when a cartel leader, this so-called kingpin strategy where you're decapitating the leaders of the cartel, that it does have a sort of a ripple effect that causes a spike in violence after somebody like El Chapo is arrested, extradited, and taken out of the picture in Mexico.
So let's talk briefly about the trial. What were some of the big surprises that have happened during these proceedings?
Every day brings a new surprise, a new bombshell, it seems. Just recently, the accusations about Enrique Peña Nieto supposedly asking for $250 million from Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel shortly after he won the election before he took office in 2012 was a bombshell. The witness who testified about that said that Chapo eventually paid a bribe of $100 million. Whether that's true or not, we heard no evidence to back it up. It was just this one cooperating witness saying that Chapo told him it was true. And that one was, everybody assumes that Mexico is corrupt, that there's rampant corruption. But to hear names, dates, and amounts said in open court, it takes it to a different level, and I think it's important to have that said. On the other side, the judge and the prosecutors in this case have really tried to keep that out, to make this a trial about El Chapo's guilt or innocence and nothing else. Whereas the defense wants to put, basically the entire government of Mexico, the entire drug war, on trial. So you've seen this push and pull where prosecutors are really trying to limit anything that's said about corruption, especially high-level corruption in foreign governments that work closely with the United States. And the defense is the one, in most cases, eliciting the testimony about these bribes. It wasn't the prosecutors who asked the witness about bribing Peña Nieto. It was the defense, which is a weird thing to be in. They're trying to elicit a statement that says their client was accused of bribing the president of Mexico. And the reason that they did that was because the guy had sort of an inconsistent story where he wasn't saying the same amounts all the time. At first, he had this $250 million ask and a $100 million payment. And then by the end of his interviews with U.S. law enforcement, he was like, I can't remember the exact number. So Chapo's lawyers are trying to say, you can't believe this guy because he changes his story. But I think that nuance might be lost on the jury.
And of course, we had a high-ranking member flip, and that was the son of Chapo's partner, correct? That was unexpected, I take it.
Not unexpected. I mean, Vicente Zambata, who is the eldest son of El Mayo Zambata, it had been known for a couple of years now that he had signed a cooperation agreement and was one of the people who was expected to testify. That doesn't make his testimony any less, powerful. But there have been several Sinaloa cartel members who have flipped on Chapo, including El Rey Zambata, who is Mayo's brother, among others.
So we talked about this briefly on the phone before we established this interview, and you recently did a piece in Vice about the connection between China and the cartel for the precursor trade. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you discovered there.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to folks involved in the drug trade in Sinaloa, it's clear that the drug trade, as it stands today, would not be able to function without a steady supply of precursor chemicals from Mexico. The drug trade in Sinaloa would not be able to function today without a steady supply of precursor chemicals from China. Those are the precursors that are used to make meth. Those are the precursors that are used to make fentanyl, and in some cases that are used to process cocaine base into cocaine. Without that, it would be a totally different ballgame in Sinaloa. What we found what some of the recent reporting that I've done that I thought was interesting is when you hear about fentanyl discussed in the media, for the most part, it's blamed on China. You hear that if you read or watch TV, you get the sense that all of the fentanyl that's consumed in the United States is coming through the mail from China, directly through the postal system, through couriers like UPS. If you look at the numbers, the overwhelming amount of fentanyl is seized at ports of entry in the United States coming from Mexico. There was some question about whether or not Mexican cartels were buying already synthesized fentanyl and then smuggling across the land border, or whether they were synthesizing it themselves. And, I've heard sources confirm that there are fentanyl labs active in Sinaloa as we speak. We've had a couple seized as recently as last November. There was a Sinaloa cartel fentanyl lab busted in Mexicali.
Yeah, I have no doubt. If you can make meth at 80% purity, which is certainly what we're seeing now, you can easily make fentanyl, and that's why I think I try to fight back against the idea that there is one monolithic market, and if you're in parts of Ohio, that's why you're seeing some of the analogs. Carfentanyl is, according to a source that I spoke to, he attributed the spike between 2016 and 2017 in fatals almost entirely to carfentanyl, and yet carfentanyl has been almost non-existent in Philadelphia's market. Mm-hmm. And that's because I believe we're on the corridor where we're getting relatively low purity. It comes across the border at 7 to 10% already. The media, I think, has done a really bad job of sort of explaining that and the nuances in what this illicitly made substance is.
And I think it's also understanding why fentanyl. I mean, on the one hand, it is much more lucrative for the cartel because that you don't need to process opium gum. You can cut farmers out. On the other hand, as demand for opioids increased in the United States, the cartels were faced with a supply challenge. It's like, how do you meet the demand with this limited, finite resource of poppies and opium gum? And I don't know who in the cartel had this idea, but somewhere along the way, they realized that we can synthesize fentanyl and mix that in with the so-called China white heroin, the white powdered heroin, and stretch it out and be able to not only meet the demand but make more money along the way.
Yeah, and I believe for a while they were selling it as heroin, and along the distributors along the way were paying heroin prices, because at some point over the past year and a half, and at least in Philadelphia, we're starting to see seizures where milling houses have fentanyl and heroin packaged separately. They kind of figured out, hey, we're getting conned here in a way, So I guess to wrap up, I would just say, you've done an amazing job. I encourage everyone to listen to the podcast, and I would ask you what your biggest, your biggest takeaway was. You obviously had a pretty strong knowledge of cartel politics prior to producing this. What was the biggest takeaway for you, and then how do you think the trial is going to wrap up? I mean, what is it trending towards? What does the jury look like they're believing and not believing?
In terms of the biggest takeaway from this reporting experience, I think, I was already a believer in investing in treatment and investing in harm reduction, and this basically made me double down on that. There's just no way to use the cliche, arrest your way out of this problem. This is a demand problem, not a supply problem. And as long as the U.S. government's policies are focused on killing and capturing cartel members in Mexico and not, helping Americans who are struggling with drug addiction, we're going to lose. It's going to fail.
So this is not experiencing this and being in Mexico and seeing how this impacts, life there. It hasn't in any way changed you back into like some sort of staunch drug warrior. I mean, what do you see as is there a solution to this problem?
America should think long and hard about a radical overhaul of drug laws. You look at what's happened with marijuana. For a long time, that was a steady cash crop for the cartel. Our reporting, speaking to farmers who used to grow marijuana, that's basically worthless for them now. There's no demand for, Mexican marijuana, for brickweed in the United States, because you can get that in some cases legally in, most of the western U.S., some of the Northeast at this point. And it's an interesting thought experiment to say, well, what if, suddenly opioids were legal or cocaine were legal or decriminalized, and if the cartel was no longer able to make money off of those substances, you could make a pretty convincing argument that the cartel wouldn't exist.
Donald Trump made such an argument in 1993, which I never, it always pleases me to point out as much as I can. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Keegan Hamilton is an editor at Vice News and host of the podcast Chapo, Kingpin on Trial. You can find him on Twitter at KEEGAN_Hamilton. Thanks for listening to episode 12 of Narcotica. Narcotica is an independent production by Christopher Moraff, Zachary Stiegel, and myself, Troy Farah. The cold open music is by Scan Globe, followed by For Me, and our theme music is by Glassboy. You can follow us on Twitter at NarcoCast or on narcocast.com. If you like the program and you want to support us, there are a few ways you can help. Tell a friend about us. Most podcasts become popular via word of mouth, or give us a decent rating on iTunes, Stitcher, Overcast, wherever you get your podcasts. You can also become a patron at patreon.com/narcotica, where you'll get access to exclusive bonus content and help us pay our bills a little bit. We are so grateful for the people that make this program possible. Thank you. If you want to send us a suggestion, tell us about Mexican fentanyl, or just want to say hi, you can email us at tips@narcocast.com. That's all for now. Take care.